Sarah Hawkins lived alone on her Wyoming homestead, keeping to herself and working her land. That all changed the day she found him. A well-dressed stranger collapsed near her creek, bleeding from a gunshot wound. She did what any decent person would do. She took him in and nursed him back to health. But word spreads fast in small towns, and soon the settlers were convinced she was harboring Deadeye Dan, the notorious outlaw. They didn't wait for proof. They didn't ask questions. They just came for her with ropes and rifles, ready to hang a woman for showing mercy to a wounded man. But as Sarah stands at the gallows, surrounded by angry faces, a mysterious figure appears on the horizon. The truth about the stranger's identity will change everything. Will Sarah's act of kindness lead to her death, or will the man she saved arrive in time to reveal a secret that could save them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Wyoming sky in shades of amber and rose as Sarah Hawkins stepped onto her cabin's worn porch. The April morning carried winter's last bite, but she'd learned long ago that the work wouldn't wait for warmer weather. 5 years of homesteading alone had taught her that much. She adjusted her father's old rifle across her back, more a tool than a weapon these days, though the weight of it still brought comfort. The morning chores followed their familiar rhythm. Checking the chicken coop, feeding the horses, and inspecting the fence line that marked her modest kingdom. Every day the same, and that's exactly how she preferred it. The creek that cut through her property ran higher than usual, swollen with spring melt. Sarah paused at its bank, watching the water rush past as she filled her bucket. That's when she heard it, a sound so faint she almost missed it beneath the creek's steady song. A groan, human and hurt. Sarah set down her bucket, hand moving instinctively to her rifle. "Who's there?" Her voice carried the strength she'd cultivated since burying her husband 3 years ago. No answer came, just another pained sound from behind the tall grass. She found him collapsed near a bend in the creek, half hidden by the vegetation. Even sprawled in the dirt, there was something refined about him, his clothes too fine for these parts, despite the trail dust and blood that stained them. A bullet wound marked his left shoulder, the fabric around it dark and crusty. "Mister?" Sarah knelt beside him, keeping one hand near her rifle. "Can you hear me?" His eyes flickered open, striking blue despite the fever glaze that covered them. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak cough. Something fell from his limp fingers, a gold pocket watch that caught the morning light. Sarah picked it up, noting the fine engraving. "To James Hamilton III, from Father." The man's eyes closed again as he slipped back into unconsciousness. Sarah knew she faced a choice that would echo through whatever time remained to her. The smart thing would be to ride for the sheriff, let the law sort out who this stranger was and why he had a bullet in him. That's what her neighbors would say, what common sense dictated. But Sarah Hawkins hadn't survived out here by ignoring her instincts. There was something about this man's face, even in his injured state, that spoke of honor rather than villainy. And that watch, no outlaw she'd ever heard of, carried something so personal, so clearly marked with a real name. "Lord help me," she muttered, already knowing what she would do. "You'd better not make me regret this, Mr. Hamilton." It took all her strength to get him on her horse. By the time she led them back to her cabin, the morning sun had climbed high, enough to cast judgment on her decision. Sarah paused at her door, looking back at the vast Wyoming landscape. Out there somewhere, someone had tried to kill this man. By taking him in, she was making their business her own. She thought of her husband then, of how he died because someone hadn't stopped to help when he was injured in a mining accident. The memory steeled her resolve as she maneuvered the unconscious stranger into her home. "Well," she said to the empty air, "looks like today won't be following the usual routine after all." The gold watch sat heavy in her pocket, ticking away. The moments until her quiet life would change forever. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she retrieved the old medicine box from beneath her bed. The wooden case still bore the faded inscription, "Property of Dr. Samuel Green, 4th Infantry Medical Corps." Her fingers traced the letters briefly before opening the lid. Inside, memories of the war lay arranged in neat compartments. Rolls of bandages, bottles of carbolic acid, surgical needles, and the precious few medicines she'd managed to keep stocked. The box had been a parting gift from the doctor who'd taught her nursing during those bloody years. "Some wounds," he'd told her, "don't stop bleeding just because the war does." The stranger lay on her bed, his breathing shallow but steady. She'd managed to remove his coat and shirt, revealing not just the bullet wound, but a story written in scars across his torso. Some were old, long-healed. Others seemed fresher, speaking of a life lived dangerously. "What kind of man are you?" "Mr. Hamilton," she murmured, cleaning around the wound. The bullet had gone clean through, which was both blessing and curse. Less chance of infection, but more blood loss to contend with. A memory surfaced as she worked. The field hospital in Virginia, Dr. Green guiding her hands through her. First bullet wound treatment. "Steady now, Sarah. A nervous hand does more harm than the bullet sometimes." The stranger stirred, his fever-bright eyes opening. "Where?" His voice came rough, barely above a whisper. "My homestead," Sarah replied, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "About 20 miles east of Larkspur. You've been shot." He tried to sit up, but fell back with a groan. "Have to warn. The only thing you have to do is lie still." Sarah's tone brooked no argument. "Unless you'd prefer to bleed out after I went to all this trouble." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am." His eyes drifted to the medicine box, widening slightly at the military inscription. "War nurse," Sarah explained, measuring out laudanum drops. "Though these days I mostly patch up fence cuts and the occasional broken bone. Fortunate for me." He accepted the medicine, grimacing at the taste. Sarah watched as the laudanum took effect, his features relaxing. In sleep, the rigid control she'd glimpsed in his face softened, revealing a younger man than she'd first thought. Mid-30s, perhaps, with lines that spoke more of worry than age. As she stitched the wound, her mind wandered to the gold watch, now hidden in her dresser drawer. James Hamilton III. The name tickled something in her memory. Hadn't she seen it in a newspaper or heard it mentioned in town? Something about cattle interests up north. The sun was setting by the time she finished, casting long shadows through her cabin windows. She'd need to tend the animals soon, but first she checked his temperature. Still too high, but not dangerously so. With proper care, he'd live, assuming whatever trouble had brought him here didn't catch up first. A sound outside froze her in place. Hoofbeats on the trail. Sarah moved quickly to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. 3 riders passed by, heading toward town. She didn't recognize them, but their manner set off warnings in her mind. The way they studied every homestead they passed, how their hands stayed close to their weapons. The stranger muttered something in his sleep, his face tightening with pain or memory. Sarah drew the curtains fully closed and lit a lamp, keeping the flame low. Whatever storm this man had brought to her door, she was committed now. She'd learned, during the war, that healing wasn't just about treating wounds. It was about protecting patients until they could protect themselves. "Rest easy, Mr. Hamilton," she whispered, checking the loads in her rifle. "You're safe here." But as she settled in for a long night of watching, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a promise she might not be able to keep. The town of Larkspur wasn't much to look at. A single dusty street lined with false front buildings, trying their best to look more substantial than they were. Sarah guided her wagon past the livery stable, noting how conversations died as she passed. News traveled fast in small towns, and the presence of strangers always stirred up talk. She'd left her patient sleeping, dosed with laudanum and hidden behind a false panel she'd built during the war years. Some called her paranoid for keeping such secrets in her home. Right now, that paranoia felt more like wisdom. The general store's bell announced her arrival. Old Man Tucker looked up from his ledger, his weathered face creasing into a smile. Miss Sarah was beginning to think you'd forgotten about us out here. Just busy with spring planting, Mr. Tucker. She handed him her list of supplies, keeping her expression neutral. Seems like there's more folks than usual in town today. Tucker's smile faded slightly. Ah, you noticed that, did you? Bunch came through yesterday asking questions. He moved to gather her supplies, lowering his voice. There's talk of Dead-Eye Dan being in the area. Sarah's heart skipped, but her face remained calm. That outlaw from up north? The very same. Marshal's office in Cheyenne sent telegrams to every town in the territory. Tucker reached beneath his counter and pulled out a crumpled paper. Posted this morning. Sarah studied the telegram, her blood running cold. Alert all stations. Dangerous outlaw. Daniel Dead-Eye Dan. Matthews believed heading south. Shot up Hamilton Ranch. Wanted dead or alive. 5,000 reward. Considered. Armed and extremely dangerous. Stop terrible business, Tucker continued, wrapping her purchases. They say he killed 2 men up at Hamilton Ranch before disappearing. Some folks think he's wounded, though. There's blood trails leading south. The store's bell rang again. Sheriff Wade stepped in, his badge catching the morning light. Sarah had never liked the man. Something in his eyes reminded her of the worst officers she'd treated during the war, the ones who valued power more than people. Miss Hawkins, he nodded, moving to the counter. Don't usually see you in town this early. Sheriff. She gathered her packages, keeping her voice level. Just restocking supplies. Been meaning to ride out your way. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. Had reports of strangers in the area. You haven't seen anyone unusual out your way, have you? No one but the usual traders. The lie came smooth as silk, though I did see some riders yesterday heading toward town. Didn't recognize them. That so? Wade leaned against the counter. What did they look like? Didn't get a good look. I was busy with my fences. She nodded to Tucker. Thank you for the supplies, Mr. Tucker. Sheriff. Outside, Sarah loaded her wagon with steady hands, though her mind raced. The telegram complicated things. Hamilton Ranch, the same name as the watch, but her patient couldn't be Dead-Eye Dan, could he? The timing fit, but nothing else about him matched the story she'd heard of the notorious outlaw. Miss Hawkins. She turned to find young Tommy from the telegraph office running toward her, waving another yellow paper. This came for you, right after you left last time. Been holding it nearly a week. Sarah took the telegram, her chest tightening as she read, Sarah, stop. Coming to visit next month. Bringing good news about land grant. Watch for trouble. Not all friends here. James Hamilton III. Stop. The date on the telegram was 5 days ago. The day before she'd found her wounded stranger. Everything all right, Miss Hawkins? Tommy asked, noticing her expression. Yes, just news from back east. She tucked the telegram into her pocket, beside the first one. Thank you. Tommy. As she drove her wagon out of town, Sarah felt eyes following her. Sheriff Wade stood in front of his office, watching her departure with too much interest. Whatever game was being played here, she was now caught in the middle of it. The spring wind carried dust and whispers across the street, and Sarah remembered something her father used to say. Truth is like water in the desert, precious, hard to find, and sometimes dangerous to those who discover it. Night fell over the homestead like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the sound of coyotes in the distance. Sarah sat beside her patient's bed, watching as he tossed in fever-induced dreams. His wound wasn't infected. She'd made sure of that, but the strain of injury and blood loss had taken its toll. No, can't let them, he muttered, his fingers clutching at the sheets. The deed, father's land. Sarah dipped a cloth in cool water, placing it on his forehead. As she did, something fell from his shirt pocket where it lay folded on her chair. A half-burned letter, its edges charred and crumbling. She hesitated before picking it up, her conscience warring with necessity. If he was who she feared. The readable portions told a fragmented story. Hamilton Ranch must be protected. Wade and his men, land grab using Dead-Eye Dan's name, forge father's signature, burn the evidence, meet at midnight. The rest was lost to fire and ash, but it was enough to make Sarah's heart race. She thought of the telegram in her pocket of Sheriff Wade's too keen interest in her homestead. Elizabeth, the stranger's voice was clearer now, though his eyes remained closed. Have to warn Elizabeth. Who's Elizabeth? Sarah asked softly, though she didn't expect an answer. His eyes opened, startlingly lucid despite the fever. My sister. They'll try to force her to sell once they think I'm dead. Who will? Wade and his masters. He tried to sit up but fell back with a groan. They're using Dead-Eye Dan as cover, making it look like you're him, Sarah finished. You're James Hamilton III. He nodded weakly. Father died last month, left the ranch to Elizabeth and me. But Wade, he's working for the cattle barons. They want our water rights. Sarah thought of the wealthy ranchers up north, how they'd been buying or taking every piece of land with decent water access. Her own small creek was one of the few independent water sources left in the area. The attack at your ranch, she said. They made it look like Dead-Eye Dan, but it was really them. Smart woman. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Should have known way you handled that wound. Warn us, among other things. She showed him the burned letter. Found this in your pocket. His face tightened. Only proof of their plan was taking it to the federal marshal when they caught up. The pieces were falling into place now. Why Wade was so interested in her homestead. Why those riders kept passing by. They weren't looking for Dead-Eye Dan. They were making sure their false trail had worked, that James Hamilton III wouldn't live to expose their scheme. Elizabeth thinks I'm dead, he said, his voice heavy with worry. If she sells, she won't, Sarah assured him, though she had no right to make such promises. But first, we need to get you well enough to travel. He caught her hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his weakness. Why are you helping me? Most would have turned me in, claimed the reward. Sarah thought of her husband, of all the times life had shown her the difference between law and justice, because sometimes doing right isn't the same as following rules. She squeezed his hand before letting go. Now rest, you'll need your strength. As his breathing steadied into sleep, Sarah moved to her window, watching the moonlit landscape. Somewhere out there, Wade and his men were probably still searching, confident that time and fear would accomplish what their bullets hadn't. But they hadn't counted on a woman who'd learned in war that healing wasn't just about mending bodies. It was about protecting those who fought for what was right, no matter the cost. She touched the burned letter in her pocket, this fragile proof of corruption that had nearly cost a man his life. Come morning, she'd need to make another trip to town, this time to send a carefully coded message to Elizabeth Hamilton. Then she'd watch and wait and pray that she was still wise enough to tell the difference between a good man and a well-crafted lie. Sarah was feeding the chickens when she heard horses approaching. The sound of multiple riders made her stomach clench, but she forced herself to continue scattering feed, movements deliberate and unhurried. Only when Sheriff Wade's voice rang out did she look up. Morning, Miss Hawkins. He sat atop his horse, 3 deputies flanking him. A badge glinted on his chest, but not his usual one. This star was from Cheyenne County, a good 100 miles north. Sheriff? She dusted her hands on her apron. Long ride from Cheyenne. A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he masked it. Just borrowed the badge. Marshal's office deputized us to help with the manhunt. He dismounted, boots raising dust. Mind if we have a look around? It wasn't really a question. Sarah gestured toward her cabin, mind racing. James was hidden below the false floor, but any thorough search would find the trap door. Searching all the homesteads? Wade continued. As they walked, Dead-Eye Dan's trail led this way. You live alone out here. Wouldn't want you running into him unawares. Thoughtful of you. Sarah kept her voice neutral as they entered her cabin. The medicine box sat in plain sight. No time to hide it. She'd have to brazen through. Wade's eyes caught on the military inscription. War nurse, weren't you? Field Hospital, Virginia. She moved to put coffee on the stove, giving herself a reason to stay near the hidden trapdoor. Saw enough violence there to last a lifetime. Then you understand why we need to be thorough. He nodded to his deputies. Check everything, every corner, every cabinet. The men spread out, rough hands disturbing her ordered life. Sarah watched them rifle through her belongings, her heart pounding at every step near the hidden door. One deputy picked up the medicine box. Careful with that, she snapped. Those supplies aren't easy to replace. Let me see that. Wade took the box, examining it with too much interest. Lot of supplies for treating fence cuts. I help neighbors when needed. Nearest doctor's 2 days' ride. A deputy called from her bedroom. Sheriff, blood on these rags. Sarah's mind raced, then settled on a truth that could serve as cover. Mrs. Peterson's boy cut himself bad on barbed wire 2 days ago. I burned the worst of the bandages, but some were worth saving to boil clean. Wade studied her face. Sarah met his gaze steadily, though her pulse roared in her ears. Below their feet, separated by mere inches of wood, James lay silent in his hidden space. One wrong move, one creak of the boards. What's this? Another deputy emerged from her bedroom, holding something that made Sarah's blood freeze. James's gold watch, which she'd forgotten to hide after reading the inscription. Wade took it, his face darkening as he read the engraving. Now this is interesting. Where'd you get Hamilton's watch, Miss Hawkins? Sarah's mind worked faster than her racing heart. Bought it off a trader last week. Seemed too fine to pass. Up, though I probably paid more than I should. She forced a self-deprecating laugh. Didn't know it belonged to anyone important. That's so. Wade's hand moved to rest on his gun. Funny thing, we found James Hamilton's body up north. Shot. Dead at his ranch. Yet here's his watch, clean as can be, no blood on it at all. I told you, the trader, enough lies. Wade's voice cracked like a whip. Where is he, Miss Hawkins? Where's Hamilton? The question hung in the air, heavy as thunder before. A storm. But before Sarah could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Sheriff Wade! A rider appeared at her door, breathless. Smoke signals from the south line. Looks like we found him. Wade's attention snapped to the messenger. How far? 10 miles, near the old Miller place. Boys saw someone matching the description heading into the caves. Sarah kept her face carefully blank, though her mind raced. Someone was creating a diversion. But who? Wade hesitated, looking between Sarah and the distant promise of his quarry. Finally, he pocketed the watch. We'll continue this discussion. Later, Miss Hawkins. Don't go anywhere. She stood in her doorway, watching them ride south, dust billowing in their wake. Only when they disappeared over the rise did she allow herself to breathe, her hands shaking as she lifted the trapdoor. James looked up at her from the hidden space, pale but alert. Smoke signals. Someone's helping us, Sarah said. Helping him out. But Wade has your watch now. He knows you're alive. Then we're running out of time. James grimaced as he straightened. We need to get word to Elizabeth before they force her to sell. Sarah nodded, already planning. First, we need to move you. Wade will be back, and next time he won't leave without searching every board in this cabin. The sun was setting, as they stood in her doorway, watching the horizon for any sign of returning riders. Sarah thought of Wade's borrowed badge, of the power it represented. Not just one corrupt sheriff, but an entire network of powerful men, willing to kill for water rights and land. They were two people against an empire of greed. But Sarah had faced worse odds in the war, and James, well, he'd survived there. First attempt to kill him. Maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Night had fallen by the time they reached the abandoned shepherd's hut in the high meadow. Sarah had used it before as a way station when winter storms made the trek home impossible. Now it would serve as their refuge. James sank onto a rough wooden bench, his wound clearly paining him despite his attempts to hide it. Sarah busied herself starting a fire in the small hearth, trying not to think about her abandoned homestead or the risks they'd taken getting here. There's something you need to see, James said, reaching into his coat. He withdrew a folded document. Its edges worn, but the wax seal still intact. My father's original land deed. Sarah moved closer to the firelight, studying the document as James unfolded it. The deed was dated 1845, signed by territorial officials long since dead. But what caught her eye was the detailed map included with the property description. The water rights, she breathed, understanding dawning. Your father's deed includes the headwaters of 3 major rivers, James finished. That's what they're really after. Whoever controls those waters controls every ranch and farm for 50 miles. Father knew it, kept refusing their offers to buy. And now they're trying to force Elizabeth to sell by making her think you're dead. James nodded grimly. Wade's just their puppet. The real power is the Western Cattle Association. Rich men back east who've never worked the land a day in their lives. Sarah traced the waterways on the map. These streams feed my creek too, don't they? Every independent homestead in the territory depends on that water. If the association gets control, they can force everyone out. Sarah's mind went to her neighbors, families who'd worked their land for generations. That's why they created this Dead-Eye Dan story, to terrorize people into selling cheap. James winced as he shifted position. Found out too much. Was taking evidence to the federal marshal when they ambushed me. Didn't expect me to survive. But you did. Sarah retrieved her medicine box, checking his wound by firelight. And now we have proof of their scheme. Proof won't matter if we can't get it to someone who'll act on it. He caught her hand as she worked, his grip gentle but urgent. Sarah, I haven't been entirely honest with you. She stilled, waiting. I'm not just trying to save the ranch. I'm a federal investigator, have been working to expose the association's corruption for months. That's why they want me dead. I know names, dates, bribes paid. Instead of pulling away, Sarah found herself squeezing his hand. Explains a few things. The way you handle yourself, how you survived their ambush. You're not angry I didn't tell you sooner? You were unconscious for most of our acquaintance, she said dryly. Besides, I'm good at keeping secrets. War taught me that much. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, an owl called. Once, twice. Sarah tensed, but the night remained still. We need to get to Elizabeth, James said. She's clever, won't sell easily. But if they convince her I'm truly dead, first you need to heal. Sarah's tone brooked no argument. I didn't save you just to watch you bleed out playing hero. A smile touched his lips. Yes, ma'am. His eyes held hers for a moment longer. The necessary. Thank you, Sarah. Not many would have taken the risks you have. She busied herself with the bandages, hoping the firelight hid her flush. Yes, well, someone has to stand up to men like Wade. Might as well be us. The deed lay between them, its boundaries marking not just land, but a battle line between greed and justice. Sarah thought of her own small homestead, of all the others, that would suffer if the association won. Tomorrow they would need to move again, find a way to reach Elizabeth before Wade and his masters forced her hand. But tonight, in this hidden shelter high above the valleys, they had a moment to rest and plan, and perhaps, though neither would admit it, to acknowledge the growing warmth between them that had nothing to do with the fire's glow. Sarah slipped into the back of the crowded town hall, pulling her shawl closer around her face. The meeting notice had been posted everywhere in Larkspur, Emergency Town. Meeting by order of Sheriff Wade, subject, outlaw threat and public safety. Attendance mandatory absence will be noted. The threat in those last words wasn't subtle. She'd left James hidden in the shepherd's hut, promising to return with news and supplies. Now, watching her neighbors pack the hall, she wondered if she'd made a mistake coming at all. Quiet down, everyone! Sheriff Wade stood at the front, that borrowed Cheyenne County badge still gleaming on his chest. We've got serious business to discuss. The crowd settled, though tension hummed in the air like heat lightning before a storm. Sarah recognized faces all around her, people she'd helped, healed, traded with over the years. Would they turn on her so easily? Most of you've heard about Dead-Eye Dan being in the area, Wade continued. What you might not know is he's been spotted right here in our community. And worse, he's got help. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarah kept her face carefully blank. That's right. Someone's harboring him. One of our own neighbors. Helping a killer who'd just as soon shoot you as look at you. Old man Tucker spoke up from his seat near the front. How do you know that, Sheriff? Wade pulled out James's gold watch, holding it high. Because we found this, belonging to one of his victims, James Hamilton III, murdered up north. And where did we find it? Right here in Larkspur. The crowd's muttering grew louder. Sarah felt eyes turning her way, remembered how public her supply run had been. Now, I'm not naming names, Wade said, though his gaze swept meaningfully across the room. Not yet. But I want everyone thinking hard about any strangers they've seen, any neighbors acting odd. Because whoever's helping this outlaw, they're just as guilty as he is. What do you want us to do? Someone called out. Keep, watch, report anything suspicious, and most importantly, Wade's voice hardened. Don't take the law into your own hands. That's what poses are for. Sarah's blood ran cold at the emphasis he placed on that last part. He was setting the stage, she realized. When violence came, he'd be able to claim he tried to prevent it. Mrs. Peterson stood up, her thin voice carrying surprisingly well. What about the Hamilton Ranch situation? My cousin up north says there's more to that story. Wade's face tightened for just a moment before smoothing out. Tragic business, but let's focus on protecting our own community. I've got men watching the roads, but we need every eye alert. Deadeye Dan's wounded. He can't have gone far. I heard he was seen near the Creeklands, one of Wade's deputies called out, too casually to be genuine. Up by the independent homesteads. More eyes turned Sarah's way. She forced herself to meet them calmly, though her heart raced. They were laying the groundwork, she realized, setting up her homestead as the likely target for their posse. The meeting continued, but Sarah had heard enough. She slipped out quietly, using the deepening dusk as cover. As she mounted her horse, a voice stopped her. Miss Hawkins. She turned to find Mrs. Peterson approaching, her aged face grave in the failing light. That cousin I mentioned? She says James Hamilton was no ordinary rancher, says he was looking into water rights, asking questions about the association. The old woman glanced around before continuing softly. Says he had powerful enemies. Sarah chose her words carefully. Sounds like dangerous knowledge. Knowledge is only dangerous to those with something to hide. Mrs. Peterson pressed a small package into her hands. Some extra medical supplies. Never know when they might be needed. Their eyes met in the gathering darkness, understanding passing between them. Sarah wasn't as alone as Wade wanted her to feel. As she rode home through the night, Sarah replayed Wade's performance. He was building something worse than a posse. He was creating a mob, one that would act out of fear rather than justice. And when violence came, he'd stand back, claiming his hands were clean. But she'd seen this before, during the war. Knew how quickly fear could turn neighbors against each other. The meeting notice in her pocket felt heavy as lead, its mandatory attendance requirement a reminder of how power worked in small towns. Time was running out. They needed to reach Elizabeth before Wade's carefully orchestrated mob turned from whispers to weapons. The shepherd's hut came into view just as dawn broke over the mountains. Sarah urged her horse faster, something about the silence setting her nerves on edge. As she approached, she saw what was wrong. The door stood slightly open, swaying in the morning breeze. Her heart stopped when she saw Martha Collins' horse tethered outside. Martha had been her closest friend since the war, the only other nurse from their unit who'd settled in these parts. They'd helped each other through the worst of times, shared secrets and sorrows. Sarah had even given her a matching locket, sisters in all but blood, they'd promised. Now Martha stood inside the hut, staring at James's empty bedroll. She turned as Sarah entered, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. The locket gleamed at her throat. I followed you, Martha said, quietly. Last night after the meeting I didn't want to believe it. Martha, let me explain. Explain what? That you're harboring a murderer? That everything Wade said was true? Her voice cracked with betrayal. "None of it's true." Sarah moved slowly, keeping her voice calm. "Wade's the real criminal here. James Hamilton isn't dead, and he's not Deadeye. Dan, he's—" "Stop." Martha's hand trembled as she pulled out a small revolver. "Just stop lying, Sarah. I saw his watch at the meeting. I know he's here somewhere." Sarah's mind raced. James had gone to check the back trail, but he'd be returning soon. She had to keep Martha talking. "Remember when Tom died?" Sarah said softly. "How everyone said it was just a mining accident, but you knew better. Remember how they tried to silence you?" Martha's grip on the gun wavered. "That was different. Was it? The same men who covered up Tom's death are behind this. The Western Cattle Association." "Don't!" Martha's voice rose sharply. "Don't you dare use Tom to justify this." In her agitation, she stepped backward, catching the chain of her locket on a wall hook. The sudden jerk snapped the chain, sending the locket crashing to the floor. It broke open, spilling a tiny photograph, Tom Collins in his mining clothes, smiling at a future that would never come. The moment stretched like pulled taffy, both women staring at the broken locket. Then they heard it, hoofbeats approaching. "Martha, please," Sarah whispered. "Wade's men killed James's father, just like the association killed Tom. They're trying to steal the water rights, force everyone off their land. James is a federal investigator. He can prove it all." Confusion and doubt warred on Martha's face. The hoofbeats grew closer. "If I'm lying," Sarah continued, "then I deserve whatever comes. But if I'm telling the truth, if Wade and his masters are killing innocent people, can you live with that knowledge? Like you've lived with Tom's truth?" Martha's hand shook violently now. Outside, voices called to each other, men spreading out to surround the hut. "Miss Collins!" Wade's voice boomed. "You signal us if she's in there!" Martha looked at the broken locket, at the photograph of her dead husband. Then at Sarah, the friend who'd held her through nights of grief, who'd never once questioned her certainty about Tom's death. "Go," she whispered, lowering the gun. "There's a trail behind the hut through the rocks. They don't know about it yet." Sarah grabbed her friend's hand. "Come with us. You'll be safer." "No." Martha managed a weak smile. "I'll slow them down, buy you time. It's what Tom would have done." Tears burned Sarah's eyes as she squeezed Martha's hand one last time. Then she was running just as James appeared at the back of the hut, gesturing urgently. Behind them, they heard Martha's voice ring out. "She was here, Sheriff, headed north, toward the river. Hurry!" They fled through the rocks as Wade's men thundered past, following Martha's false trail. Sarah's heart ached with each step, knowing she might never see her friend again. The broken locket lay forgotten on the shepherds' hut floor, its spilled secrets a reminder that truth once revealed could never be hidden again. Like the water rights Wade sought to control, it would find its way to the surface, no matter how deep it was buried. James caught Sarah's arm as she stumbled, steadying her. "Your friend," he said softly. "She made her choice." "Yes." Sarah wiped her eyes. "And now we have to make sure it wasn't for nothing." They pressed on through the wilderness, two people against an empire of greed. But now they carried another burden, the weight of Martha's sacrifice, and the knowledge that every choice, every betrayal, every act of faith sent ripples through lives like water through the Wyoming earth. The hunting horn's call echoed. Through the canyons, 3 sharp blasts that sent birds scattering from the trees. Sarah recognized the signal from her war days. It meant the hunters had found their prey. "They're flanking us," James said, pulling his horse up short behind. "A granite outcropping, using the old cavalry pursuit pattern." Sarah heard the thunder of hooves, splitting into 2 groups, one heading high into the ridges, while the other followed the creek bed below. The horn sounded again. Closer now. "We need to separate," she said, already formulating a plan. "They're expecting us to stay together, head straight for Elizabeth's ranch." James shook his head. "I won't leave you. You have to." Sarah pulled out her map, speaking quickly. "Elizabeth's ranch is 2 days' hard ride north, but there's a telegraph station at Miller's Crossing, half a day east." I can send word to the federal marshal while you warn your sister. They'll be watching both routes. That's why we split their forces." She touched his arm, feeling the fever still burning beneath his skin. "You're not fully healed. You'll need every advantage to reach Elizabeth in time." The horn called again, answered by another from the opposite ridge. The net was closing. "Take my horse," Sarah continued. "He knows the high trails. I'll create a distraction, make them think we're both heading east." James caught her hand, his eyes intense. "If they catch you, they won't kill me. Not right. Away. They'll want to make an example, just like they planned with you." She managed a grim smile. "I learned a few things about buying time in the war." The sound of horses grew closer. James pulled out his father's pocket watch, the one Wade had taken, which Martha had somehow returned with the medical supplies. 2 days, he said, pressing the watch into her hands. "If you don't hear from me by then, get word to Marshal Conway in Cheyenne. He knows about the investigation." Sarah tucked the watch away, then did something that surprised them both. She pulled James close and kissed him, brief but fierce. 2 days, she echoed. "Now go." They split up, James taking her horse up through the narrow deer trails only locals knew, while Sarah led his more conspicuous mount down toward the creek. She made sure to leave clear tracks, broken branches, all the signs Wade's men would be looking for. The hunting horn sounded one final time as she reached the water. Sarah smiled grimly as she heard the pursuit turn her way. The war had taught her that sometimes the best way to protect someone was to become the target yourself. She led them on a chase that would have made her cavalry friends proud, doubling back, crossing the creek repeatedly to confuse the trail, using every trick she'd learned in 4 years of running medical supplies through Confederate lines. But even the best strategy couldn't overcome pure numbers. They caught up with her near sunset, just as she'd planned, far from where James would be riding north. The horn blast that announced her capture had a note of triumph that made her skin crawl. "Well, well," Wade drawled as his men surrounded her, the loyal nurse playing decoy. He studied her face. "Where's Hamilton?" "Probably halfway to the marshal's office by now." The lie came easily, telling them all about your borrowed badge and false charges. The blow caught her across the face, snapping her head back. But Sarah just laughed, tasting blood. Every moment they spent questioning her was another mile James could cover. "String her up here," one of the deputies suggested, fingering his rope. "No." Wade's eyes glittered with cruel purpose. "She's going back to town. Let everyone see what happens. To folks who help outlaws, make it public, make it slow." He leaned close to Sarah. "Make it count." As they bound her hands and led her horse toward Larkspur, Sarah touched the hidden pocket where James's watch lay. 2 days. She just had to hold out for 2 days. The hunting horn sounded one last time, echoing off the canyon walls like mocking laughter. But Sarah kept her head high, let them play their games with horns and ropes and fear. She'd faced worse odds in the war, and she hadn't broken then. She wouldn't break now. They built the gallows in front of the church, a crude wooden platform that cast its shadow across the town square. Sarah watched from her jail cell as men who'd once sought her help for their injuries now hammered nails into what might be her deathbed. "Not too late to tell us where Hamilton is," Wade said, lounging against the cell bars. "Might even let you leave town instead of swing." Sarah kept her eyes on the growing crowd outside. "You know, I once watched a man survive 3 days of Confederate questioning. Never broke, and he didn't even have the truth on his side." Wade's casual demeanor slipped for just a moment. "Suit yourself, but remember, I tried to be reasonable." The afternoon sun had reached its peak when they brought her out. The crowd parted like water around a stone. Faces she'd known for years now turned strange with fear and judgment. The makeshift gallows loomed before her, rough-cut pine boards, already starting to warp in the heat. "People of Larkspur," Wade's voice rang out across the square, "we're gathered to pass judgment on one who's betrayed this community. Sarah Hawkins stands accused of harboring a known killer, of helping Dead-Eye Dan escape justice." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarah stood straight, letting her gaze meet those who would look at her. "This isn't a formal trial," Wade continued, "but we're fair people. Miss Hawkins, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Sarah looked at the faces around her. Old Man Tucker wringing his hands, Mrs. Peterson clutching her shawl, Martha. Collins standing apart, her broken locket still hanging loose around her neck. "I've lived among you for 5 years," Sarah began, her voice carrying clear and strong. "Helped birth your babies, tended your sick, mended your wounds. In all that time, have I ever given you reason to doubt my judgment? This isn't about judgment," someone shouted. "It's about the law." "The law?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Like the law that let the mining company cover up Tom Collins' death?" She saw Martha flinch. "Like the laws the cattle barons used to steal water rights from honest farmers." Wade stepped forward. "That's enough." "No, it's not nearly enough." Sarah's voice rose. "You want to hang me for helping a wounded man? Fine. But ask yourselves, who benefits from this fear you're feeling? Ask who profits when neighbors turn against neighbors." "She's trying to confuse the issue," Wade cut in. "The simple fact is, she helped a murderer escape. I helped James Hamilton III, Sarah declared, watching Wade's face pale. "Son of the man you and your masters killed up north, the federal investigator who was about to expose your whole corrupt operation." The crowd's murmuring grew louder. Wade's hand moved to his gun. "She's lying," he said, but doubt had crept into the faces around them. "Hamilton's dead. We found his body. Did you?" Sarah pressed. "Or did you just tell everyone you did, like you told them I was harboring Deadeye Dan? How many lies does it take, Sheriff, before people start questioning the badge you borrowed?" "Enough!" Wade drew his gun. "This ends now. String her up." But the crowd had shifted, uncertainty replacing blind fear. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward. "If she's lying, prove it. Show us Hamilton's body. We don't need—" "My cousin up north says there never was a body," Mrs. Peterson continued. "Says there's a lot of things about that ranch business that don't add up." Others joined in, questions piling up like storm clouds. Sarah felt the tide turning, saw the desperation growing in Wade's eyes. "This is what outlaws want," he shouted, "to turn us against each other, to make us doubt." "The only doubt here," Sarah said quietly, "is why a sheriff needs to borrow a badge from another county." The gun in Wade's hand shook. For a moment, Sarah thought he might shoot her where she stood, but even he knew that would destroy the last illusion of justice he was trying to maintain. "Lock her up," he snarled to his deputies. "Tomorrow morning, we do this proper. No more debates, no more delays." As they led her back to her cell, Sarah caught Martha's eye. A slight nod passed between them. She'd bought time. Not much, but maybe enough. The gallows stood empty as the sun set, its shadow stretching like an accusation across the town square. Sarah touched James's watch in her hidden pocket, listening to its steady tick. 1 day down, 1 to go. Night fell over Larkspur like a heavy blanket, bringing no relief from the day's heat. Sarah sat in her cell, listening to the crickets chirp outside the barred window. A single lantern cast wavering shadows on the walls, and in its light she studied the small prayer book Reverend. Matthews had slipped her during his visit. For comfort, he'd said, but when she opened it she found more than prayers. Tucked between the pages were letters, documents, carefully preserved newspaper clippings, a history of the Western Cattle Association's misdeeds that the Reverend had collected over years. "Been waiting for someone brave enough to use these," he'd whispered before leaving. Now she read them by lamplight. Reports of mysterious deaths, records of water rights suddenly transferred, evidence of bribes paid to officials. The pieces of a puzzle she'd stumbled into by saving one wounded man. "Can't sleep." Sarah looked up to find Martha standing outside her cell, holding a cup of water. They regarded each other through the bars, years of friendship hanging heavy between them. "Seems a waste to spend my last night sleeping," Sarah said, accepting the water. "Don't talk like that." Martha's voice was rough with emotion. "James will come. If he's smart, he won't. Sarah took a sip, then said carefully, "Did you get my message to the telegraph office?" Martha nodded slightly. "Sent it coded like you said? But Sarah, Wade's got men watching every road. Even if help comes, I know." Sarah touched the prayer book. "But sometimes victory isn't about surviving. It's about making sure the truth does." They sat in silence for a moment, remembering other vigils during the war. Nights spent waiting for dawn and whatever it might bring. "Tom knew, didn't he?" Sarah finally asked. "About the association. That's why they killed him." Martha's hands tightened on the bars. "He found documents. Proof of how they were poisoning groundwater to force sales. They made it look like a mine collapse, but—" She pulled out her broken locket, opening it to reveal not just Tom's picture, but a tiny folded paper behind it. "He left me this. Names, dates. I've been afraid to use it. And now I wish I'd been as brave as you." Martha reached through the bars, pressing something cold and metal into Sarah's hand. "Here. Wade took this from my desk when he borrowed that badge. Thought you might want it back." It was a small key, the one Sarah had used to unlock her medicine box during the war, a key that would also open the cell door if one were desperate enough to try. "That's treason," Sarah said softly, closing her fingers around it. "So was helping the Underground Railroad during the war. Didn't stop us then." Martha stood. "I'll be back before dawn. With friends." After she left, Sarah sat in the darkness, holding the key and touching the watch in her pocket. She thought of James, hoping he'd reached Elizabeth in time. Thought of all the people who'd suffered under the association's greed. The prayer book's pages rustled as she turned them, reading the collected evidence by lamplight. So many stories, so many lives touched by corruption. Even if she died tomorrow, these truths would live on. The Reverend would make sure of that. She remembered another night during the war when she'd sat with a dying soldier. He'd asked her why she risked her life to help strangers, and she'd told him something her father once said: "Evil wins when good people convince themselves they're powerless." Dawn was still hours away. Sarah could hear Wade's men talking outside, making their preparations for morning. She held the key Martha had given her, feeling its weight, not just metal, but the weight of choice. She could try to escape now, disappear into the night. It would be the sensible thing, the safe thing. But as she read through the prayer book's collected evidence, she knew she wouldn't. Sometimes the greatest victory wasn't in running away, but in standing your ground, in forcing evil to reveal itself in the light of day. Sarah tucked the key into her boot and settled back, watching the stars through her barred window. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. But tonight, she had proof that she wasn't alone. The key in her boot, the watch in her pocket, the prayer book in her hands, all testaments to those who chose to stand against injustice. Let Wade build his gallows. The truth, like water, would find its way to the surface. The sunrise bell tolled from the church tower, its deep bronze voice rolling across Larkspur like a death knell. Sarah stood at her cell window, watching the morning light paint the gallows in stark shadows. 5 rings, marking not just this hour, but the traditional time for executions in the territory. She'd spent the night memorizing the contents of Reverend Matthew's prayer book, committing names and dates to memory in case the written evidence didn't survive. Now she watched townsfolk gathering in the square, their faces solemn in the early light. "Time to go." Wade's voice came from behind her, accompanied by the jangle of keys. "Unless you've reconsidered telling us where Hamilton is." "You know," Sarah said, not turning around, "my father used to say there are 2 kinds of cowards in this world, those who run from evil and those who hide behind badges while doing it." The cell door creaked open. Brave words for a woman. About to hang. Better than being a man who's already dead inside. She finally faced him, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. Wade was afraid, she realized, not of her, but of what might happen if James had reached Elizabeth in time. 2 deputies led her out into the sharp morning air. The crowd parted before them, their silence heavy with tension. Sarah caught glimpses of familiar faces. Old man Tucker looking away in shame, Mrs. Peterson standing tall with quiet defiance, Martha nowhere to be seen. The sunrise bell tolled again as they reached the gallows steps. One of the deputies stumbled slightly, and Sarah felt something pressed into her hands. A small knife, slipped so smoothly she almost missed it. She let it slide up her sleeve, keeping her face impassive. "People of Larkspur," Wade's voice carried across the square. "Yesterday you let doubt cloud your judgment, but justice delayed is justice denied. We have a duty to protect our community from those who would harbor killers." A murmur ran through the crowd, but it wasn't the unquestioning agreement of yesterday. Sarah saw uncertainty in their faces, saw them looking at the borrowed badge on Wade's chest with new eyes. The sunrise bell rang a third time as they positioned her on the trapdoor. Sarah kept her head high, scanning the horizon. No sign of riders approaching. Perhaps that was for the best. James needed time to reach Elizabeth, to stop the land grab that would destroy so many lives. "If the condemned has any last words," Wade announced, "now is the time." Sarah looked out over the faces of people she'd known for years. The knife burned against her arm, offering one last chance at escape. But sometimes the greatest victory came from standing your ground. "I've spent my life healing people," she began, her voice clear and strong. "During the war, after it, here, in Larkspur, never once asked if someone deserved help, just gave it, because that's what decent folks do." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. The sunrise bell tolled a fourth time. "You all know me. No, I'm no friend to outlaws. So ask yourselves, why would I risk everything to help a stranger? Unless maybe he wasn't what Sheriff Wade claims. Unless maybe the real criminals are the ones holding the badges and making the accusations." "Enough!" Wade stepped forward, but Sarah raised her voice. "Ask why a sheriff needs to borrow a badge from another county. Ask why no one's seen James Hamilton's body. Ask why the Western Cattle Association wants his water rights so badly they'd—" The butt of Wade's pistol caught her across the face, snapping her head back. Blood trickled from her split lip, but Sarah smiled. Every moment she kept talking was another moment for something to change. The sunrise bell began its fifth and final toll. Wade moved to the lever that would open the trapdoor beneath her. Feet. Sarah felt the rough rope against her neck, smelled the hemp fibers that would carry her to judgment. "Any last prayers, Miss Hawkins?" Wade's voice dripped with false sympathy. Sarah lifted her eyes to the horizon, where the rising sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold. "Just one," she said clearly. "May God forgive you all for what you're about to witness." The bell's final tone faded into silence. Wade's hand tightened on the lever, and in that moment of perfect stillness, a single shot rang out across the square. The single shot echoed off the buildings, and Wade's deputy dropped from the church tower, his rifle clattering to the ground. From the east end of the square came the thunder of hooves, not one rider, but many. "Get away from her!" James Hamilton's voice rang across the square. He sat tall in the saddle despite his wound, silver spurs catching the morning light. The spurs bore the U.S. Marshal's star, marking him as federal law. Behind him rode a dozen men, badges glinting on their chests, real badges, from the federal marshal's office. But it was the woman beside him who drew every eye. Elizabeth Hamilton carried herself like frontier royalty, her resemblance to James unmistakable. In her hand she held documents that would destroy Wade's carefully constructed lie. "James Hamilton!" Wade's voice cracked with desperation, or should I say, Dead-Eye Dan. "Try Federal Marshal Hamilton," James called back, drawing closer. His horse's hooves struck sparks from the street. "Appointed by President Grant himself to investigate corruption in the territories. Though I suspect you knew that when you tried to kill me." The crowd erupted in whispers. Wade's hand tightened on the lever that would drop Sarah to her death. "Stay back, or she dies. Then you'll hang beside her." Elizabeth Hamilton's voice cut through the chaos. "We have proof of everything. The murdered homesteaders, the poisoned wells, the forged deeds. Father documented it all before you killed him. Sarah felt the noose tight against her throat, but she kept her eyes on James. The knife Martha had slipped her pressed against her sleeve, waiting. "Show them, Elizabeth," James commanded. "Show them what kind of man wears a borrowed badge." Elizabeth pulled out a packet of papers, her voice rising. "Telegrams proving Wade works for the Western Cattle Association. Bank drafts showing payments to create false charges against homesteaders. And this," she held up a final document, "a confession from the real Deadeye Dan, telling how Wade hired him to terrorize honest farmers." The crowd surged forward, anger turning from Sarah toward Wade. He jerked the lever halfway, making Sarah stumble as the trapdoor shifted. "Back off!" he screamed. "All of you! I'll kill her!" "No," Sarah said quietly. "You won't." The knife dropped from her sleeve into her hand. In one smooth motion, practiced during long nights in her cell, she slashed the rope above her head. As the noose went slack, she dove forward, rolling across the gallows platform as Wade's shot splintered wood where she'd stood. James and his men surged forward, but it was Martha Collins who reached Wade first. She emerged from behind the gallows, swinging a length of wood that caught him squarely in the back. Wade pitched forward, his borrowed badge flying from his chest to land in the dust. "That's for Tom!" Martha spat. The square erupted into chaos. Wade's remaining deputies tried to fight, but faced with federal marshals and angry townspeople, they quickly surrendered. James leaped from his horse, crossing the gallows platform in 2 strides to help Sarah up. "Cutting it a bit close, Marshal Hamilton," she said, letting herself lean against him. "Had to wait for Elizabeth to gather. The evidence," his arms tightened around her, "shouldn't have left you at all. Had to be done." She touched his face, noting the fever had finally broken. "Your sister seems formidable. More than you know. She's been gathering evidence against the association for months. Just needed proof I was alive to bring it all forward." Elizabeth approached, her bearing regal despite the trail dust. "So this is the woman who saved my foolish brother." She smiled warmly. "Our family owes you a debt, Miss Hawkins." "Sarah," she corrected, then nodded toward Wade being led away in handcuffs. "Will the evidence hold?" "More than hold." Elizabeth's smile turned fierce. "It will break the association's power in 3 territories. Father's death won't be for nothing." The silver spurs on James's boots clinked as he turned Sarah to face him. "I didn't just bring Elizabeth and the marshals," he said softly. "I brought a preacher too, if you're willing." Sarah looked up at him, remembering their first meeting by the creek, the trust that had grown through danger and sacrifice. "Rather bold of you to assume I'd say yes. Bold got me this far." He pulled out his father's watch, the one she'd carried through her imprisonment. "Time to make a new start, if you'll have me." The sunrise bell tolled again. Not for death this time, but for redemption. Sarah looked at the faces around her. Martha standing tall, with her broken locket now a badge of courage. Elizabeth with her evidence of justice. The townspeople awakening from their fear. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll have you." The crowd erupted. In cheers, the sound of celebration replacing the tension of near tragedy. But beneath their joy lay a deeper victory. Truth revealed, corruption exposed, and a community choosing justice over fear. The silver spurs caught the morning light as James pulled Sarah close, their shine a reminder that sometimes the law did triumph, and sometimes love grew strongest in the face of danger. The town hall buzzed with tension as Elizabeth Hamilton unfolded the confession letter, its pages worn from desperate hands that had tried to destroy it. The whole town had gathered to hear the truth. Ranchers, farmers, shopkeepers, all drawn by the promise of answers. "This confession comes from Daniel Matthews, the real Deadeye Dan," Elizabeth began, her voice carrying to every corner. "Written and signed before a federal judge in Cheyenne 2 days ago." Sarah sat beside James, feeling the warmth of his hand covering hers. Wade and his men sat in chains, their borrowed badges now symbols of their shame. "I," Daniel Matthews, known as Deadeye Dan, do hereby confess to acts of terrorism and intimidation committed under the direction of Sheriff Thomas Wade and the Western Cattle Association. The letter laid bare the whole scheme, how the association had identified key water sources throughout the territory, how they'd hired Wade to create a climate of fear, using Deadeye Dan's reputation to drive honest farmers from their land. The poisoned wells, the burned homesteads, the murders made to look like accidents, including Tom Collins. Hamilton Ranch was their biggest target. Elizabeth continued reading. The headwaters on our land control water access to 3 counties. When father refused to sell, Wade arranged his murder, made it look like a mining accident. A gasp went through the crowd. Martha Collins stood up, her voice shaking. Just like Tom, he found proof they were poisoning the Gibson Creek well. That's why they killed him. Your husband was brave, Mrs. Collins, James spoke up. His evidence helped us build our case. Father had been collecting similar proof when they killed him. Sarah watched Wade's face as his empire of lies crumbled. The man seemed to shrink in his chains. All his power, stripped away by simple truth. Elizabeth held up another document. This letter details every bribe, every corrupt official, every false deed. The association thought they could bury the truth along with their victims. But truth, like water, finds its way to the surface. What happens now? Old Man Tucker asked, his voice heavy with shame for doubting Sarah. The Federal Marshal's office is seizing association assets, James explained. Their water rights will be returned to the rightful owners. As for Wade and his conspirators, he looked at the chained men. They'll face federal judges for murder. Sarah thought of the prayer book full of evidence, of Martha's locket with its hidden proof, of all the small acts of resistance that had led to this moment. And the people they wronged? The families who lost their land? Elizabeth smiled. The government will restore legitimate deeds. There will be compensation for losses. It won't bring back those we lost, but it's a start. Wade suddenly lunged to his feet, chains rattling. You self-righteous fools. You think this changes anything? There will always be men like me taking what we want. No, Sarah said quietly, standing to face him. There will always be people who stand against men like you, people who choose justice over fear. Speaking of justice, James added, there's one more matter to settle. He nodded to his deputies, who stepped forward with new documents. These are arrest warrants for association members in 3 territories. By nightfall, their entire operation will be in federal custody. The confession letter had done more than expose a local conspiracy. It had revealed a cancer eating at the heart of the frontier and offered a chance to cut it out. Martha approached Wade, her broken locket hanging defiantly around her neck. You thought you could bury the truth with my Tom, but he kept evidence, just like Mr. Hamilton did, just like every person who chose to stand against you. The crowd murmured in agreement. Sarah saw the change in their faces, shame giving way to resolve, fear transforming into determination. The Territory Marshal's office will maintain a permanent presence here, James announced. To ensure this never happens again, Larkspur will be a free town where water rights belong to those who work the land. As the meeting dispersed, Sarah picked up the confession letter, feeling the weight of its pages. So many lives changed by these words, so many wrongs finally brought to light. You knew, didn't you? She asked James softly. When I found you, by the creek, you knew I'd help. He smiled, touching the scar on his shoulder. I knew you were the kind of person who'd do right, no matter the cost. The kind this territory needs more of. The confession letter would go to the federal courts, but copies would remain in Larkspur, a reminder that justice could prevail if people were brave enough to stand for it. A week after Wade's arrest, Sarah stood before the town council as they presented her with an official document. The town's formal apology, signed by every adult resident of Larkspur. The parchment bore careful calligraphy, but it was the names below that held real weight. Shopkeepers who'd shunned her, neighbors who'd believed Wade's lies, friends who'd turned away in fear. We, the people of Larkspur, Old Man Tucker read aloud, his voice thick with emotion, do hereby acknowledge our grave error in judgment regarding Sarah Hawkins, whose courage and moral clarity stood as an example when we faltered. Sarah touched the fresh scar on her neck where the rope had burned. Some marks, she knew, would take longer to fade than others. Furthermore, Tucker continued, we commit ourselves to ensuring that justice in Larkspur will never again be corrupted by fear or false authority. To this end, we establish a Citizens' Council to work alongside the new Federal Marshal's office. James stood beside her, his silver marshal's badge catching the light. The town hall was packed, not just with locals, but with farmers and ranchers from miles around. News of the association's fall had spread like wildfire across the territory. Martha Collins rose to speak next, the mended chain of her locket now a symbol of renewal rather than loss. We're making things right with those who were driven off their land. 17 families have already returned. The Gibson Creek water rights have been restored to their rightful owners. Sarah thought of the prayer book full of evidence now, safely preserved in the marshal's office. And Tom's name? The others who died? Officially cleared, James confirmed. The federal courts have recognized them as victims of the association's crimes. Their families will receive compensation, though we know that doesn't erase the loss. Elizabeth Hamilton stepped forward, adding her own piece to the day's proceedings. Hamilton Ranch will be establishing a legal fund, she announced, to help small farmers protect their water rights. My father believed in justice. It's time his legacy served that cause. The town apology wasn't just a document, Sarah realized. It was a blueprint for rebuilding trust, for turning shame into positive action. Mrs. Peterson spoke up from her. Your seat. What about the other territories? The association had operations everywhere. Federal marshals are moving on their holdings as we speak, James said. Elizabeth's evidence, combined with Deadeye Dan's confession, gave us what we needed. Their empire is falling piece by piece. Sarah watched sunlight stream through the town hall windows, catching dust motes in its beam. A week ago, she'd stood on the gallows outside, ready to die for what she believed. Now, she stood among neighbors who'd found their own courage. Late, but not too late. The apology is fine, she said finally, but it's your actions that matter now. How you treat the next stranger who needs help, how you question the next man who comes wearing borrowed authority. Tucker nodded gravely. We've learned that lesson, Miss Hawkins. Learned it at too high a price, maybe, but learned it true. The meeting continued, discussing practical matters of restoration and restitution. Sarah slipped outside, needing a moment of quiet. James followed, his spurs chiming softly on the wooden steps. Having second thoughts about staying, he asked softly. Sarah looked at the street where the gallows had stood. Workers were there now, turning the space into a public garden. Martha's idea, a place of growth instead of death. No, she said. Someone needs to stay and help heal these wounds. It's what I do. He took her hand, his grip warm and sure. Our wedding's still set for Sunday? Unless you're having second thoughts about marrying the town scandal. I'm marrying the town hero, he corrected, and if anyone says different, I'll remind them who really stood for justice when it mattered. Sarah touched the town apology. In her pocket, feeling the weight of all those signatures. Paper couldn't erase the past, but it could help write a better future. Like the garden growing where the gallows had been, like the restored water rights flowing free again, like the truth finally rising to the surface after years of lies. Sometimes healing meant more than just mending wounds. Sometimes it meant building something new from the broken pieces of what was lost. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the late spring air sweet with wildflowers. Sarah stood in Martha's parlor, looking down at the marriage license on the table before her. The document was deceptively simple. Just names, dates, and official seals. But like so many pieces of paper in her life lately, it carried the weight of transformation. Sarah Marie Hawkins, she read softly, and James Robert Hamilton III, to be joined in lawful matrimony. It's not too late to run, Martha teased, adjusting Sarah's wedding dress. a simple blue affair that matched the Wyoming sky. Though, I suspect every marshal in 3 territories would hunt you down. Sarah touched the license's red seal. No more running, not from this. Elizabeth entered, carrying a small wooden box. Something from Hamilton Ranch, she said, opening it to reveal a delicate silver pendant. Mother's wedding jewelry. She'd want you to have it. As Elizabeth fastened the necklace, Sarah caught her reflection in the mirror. The rope burn on her neck had faded to a pale line, mostly hidden by the silver chain. Some scars, she was learning, could become symbols of triumph rather than trauma. The garden's finished, Martha reported, pinning Sarah's hair. First roses blooming right where that gallows stood. Whole town's there already. Sarah thought of her own homestead, where James had insisted on building proper stables and a new medical room for her to treat patients. Their home would be there, not at Hamilton Ranch, a choice that had surprised everyone except Elizabeth. A marshal needs to live among the people he protects, James had said, and a healer needs to be close to those who need her. A knock at the door announced Reverend Matthews, the prayer book that had helped expose Wade's corruption, now tucked safely in his coat. "It's time," he said softly. The short walk to the garden felt like crossing years instead of yards. The newly planted roses perfumed the air, their blooms defiant against the memory of what had stood there weeks before. The whole town had gathered. Ranchers, farmers, shopkeepers and families from miles around. Even the federal judge who'd sentenced Wade had come from Cheyenne for the occasion. James waited beneath an arch of fresh-cut wildflowers, his marshal's badge gleaming alongside his father's watch chain. The silver spurs that had marked him as law when he'd ridden to her rescue now shone in the morning light. Sarah felt Martha squeeze her hand before letting go. The marriage license would mark this moment officially, but it was the faces around her that told the true story. A community healing, choosing love over fear, justice over expedience. Reverend Matthews began the ceremony, his voice carrying across the garden. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today, not just to unite 2 people, but to celebrate rebirth." As Sarah took James's hands, she saw Mrs. Peterson dabbing her eyes, Old Man Tucker standing straight and proud, children scattering flower petals where shadows of gallows had fallen. The marriage license would record their vows, but it was these moments that would live in memory. "To you, James Robert Hamilton III, Federal Marshal of the Wyoming Territory." "I do." James' voice was firm, his hands steady in hers. "And do you, Sarah Marie Hawkins, healer and protector of justice?" Sarah met his eyes, seeing in them the same courage that had first drawn her to help a wounded stranger by a creek. "I do." The marriage license would bear witness, with its official stamps and seals, but it was the cheers of the crowd that truly marked their union. As James kissed her, Sarah felt the weight of the past weeks fall away, replaced by something lighter, hope perhaps, or the promise of justice tempered with mercy. Martha stepped forward, raising a glass. "To the marshal and the healer, may they keep our water rights flowing and our conscience clear." Laughter and celebration rang out across the garden. Sarah saw Elizabeth wiping away tears, the judge nodding in approval, children dancing between the new-planted roses. The marriage license would go into the territory records, but this moment, this transformation of fear into joy, suspicion into trust, would live on in the heart of the community. As James led her into their first dance, his spurs chiming softly against the garden path, Sarah caught the glint of Martha's mended locket, saw the prayer book in the Reverend's coat, felt the weight of her mother-in-law's pendant. So many symbols of what they'd overcome, what they'd built from the ashes of corruption. "Happy," James whispered as they danced. Sarah looked at their joined hands, at the garden blooming where justice had finally prevailed, at the future stretching, bright before them. "More than," she said, "we've got work to do. Together," he agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss. 1 year later, the photographer adjusted his camera one final time, studying the group gathered on Sarah and James's expanded homestead porch. "Hold still now," he called. "This exposure takes time to set proper." Sarah sat in the center, a medical bag at her feet and a baby in her arms. James stood beside her, Marshall's badge catching the autumn light. But they weren't alone in the family portrait. Martha Collins and Elizabeth Hamilton stood with them, along with dozens of community members who'd become family in all but blood. The garden's roses from town had taken root here too, climbing the porch rails where Sarah still treated patients. The Hamilton Ranch Legal Fund had helped restore 32 families to their rightful lands. Water flowed freely again, nourishing crops and hopes alike. "Everyone ready?" the photographer asked, ducking under his black cloth. Sarah looked at the faces around her, Martha wearing her locket proudly now, Elizabeth holding the deed that protected their water rights, Mrs. Peterson and Old Man Tucker representing the town council that helped maintain justice. Even Reverend Matthew stood tall, his prayer book of evidence now transformed into a history of their triumph over corruption. Their daughter, whom they'd named Hope, stirred in Sarah's arms. The baby wore a silver pendant that had once belonged to James's mother, a legacy of love rather than loss. "Ready," Sarah said, and heard the echo from those gathered around her. The camera's flash powder ignited, capturing more than faces. It captured the story of a community transformed. The portrait would hang in the town hall, a reminder that justice could prevail when people chose courage over fear. Later that evening, as autumn's early dusk painted the sky, Sarah stood on her porch watching James teach young Tom Collins, Martha's nephew, how to care for his horse. The boy wore his uncle's name proudly now, understanding it as a symbol of standing up for right. Martha joined her, both women leaning on the rail where Sarah had once tended James's wounds. "Would you do it all again?" Martha asked softly, knowing everything that would happen. Sarah touched the faded scar on her neck, then looked at her daughter sleeping peacefully inside. Through the window, she could see the family portrait propped to dry, all those faces united by something stronger than fear. "Every moment," she said, "though I hope no one else has to. That's why we keep telling the story." James and young Tom finished with the horses and headed up to the house. In town, the garden bloomed where Gallows had stood. On Martha's desk lay documents for 3 more families reclaiming their water rights. Elizabeth's legal fund had spread to 2 more territories, helping others stand against corruption. And in Sarah's medical room, beside her mother-in-law's wedding pendant, hung a simple wooden frame containing the rope-burn salve recipe she'd discovered while treating James. She still made it for others, a reminder that healing could come in many forms. The family portrait would capture this moment, this gathering of souls who'd chosen to stand for justice. But the real story lived in the waters flowing freely through their lands, in the trust rebuilt between neighbors, in the courage to help strangers in need. "Time for supper," James called from inside. Sarah took one last look at the Wyoming sunset painting their world in shades of promise. The portrait would show their faces, but their legacy lived in every hand extended in help, every truth spoken in defense of right, every bit of healing offered to those in need. She turned toward home, toward family, both blood and chosen, toward a future they'd built from the ashes of fear. Some stories, she knew, didn't end with the last page. They lived on in the changes they inspired, in the courage they awakened, in the justice they served. And this story, like the waters they'd fought to protect, would flow on, nurturing new growth in its wake.